On a warm July night in 1979, a young couple pulled into a Dallas convenience store parking lot, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. As they stepped from their car, a man with a gun approached. What followed was a terrifying ordeal. The woman was abducted, raped, and robbed at gunpoint. Her male companion was beaten and left behind. Hours later, she gave police a description, and the search began. Days later, Cornelius Dupree Jr., just 20 years old, and Anthony Massengill, 19, were arrested. They had no criminal records for violent offenses. They didn't match the composite sketch, and both insisted they were innocent. But the victim was sure she recognized Dupree in a police lineup. That single moment of misidentification would seal their fate. There was no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no forensic links. Yet in a courtroom in 1980, the prosecution painted the two young black men as predators. Their defense lawyers did little to challenge the case. The jury convicted them both. Dupree was sentenced to 75 years. Massengill got life. They were barely out of their teens. Years turned into decades. Dupree filed appeal after appeal, all denied. Massengill remained behind bars too, serving time not just for this case, but for another conviction that would later be questioned as well. Through it all, both men never wavered in their claims of innocence. Then, in 2010, a breakthrough. DNA testing from the original rape kit was finally authorized. The results were conclusive. Neither Dupree nor Massengill matched the evidence. Dupree was released on parole just months later. In 2011, he was fully exonerated after 30 years behind bars, one of the longest wrongful imprisonments in Texas history. But the story didn't end there. Despite the same exculpatory DNA evidence, Anthony Massengill remained in prison, shackled by a separate 1979 conviction that had also been called into question. His legal team pushed for justice. Advocates rallied. The courts began a slow review. Still, years later, his freedom hangs in limbo. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. It was a case shaped by race. Two young black men accused, convicted, and forgotten in a system that too often sees guilt and skin tone alone. To understand how a misidentification destroyed two lives, and why justice came far too late for them, we have to go back. Back to that night in Dallas. Back to the moment the system got it wrong. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth, real cases, real consequences, and the darkest corners of human decision. November 1979 brought cold air to Dallas, Texas. In this sprawling city, two young black men were living ordinary lives, unaware that their paths would soon cross with tragedy and injustice. Cornelius Dupree Jr., born September 22, 1959, had just turned 20. He was a typical young man living at home with his mother, trying to find his place in the world. His only previous brush with the law had been a burglary charge that resulted in probation, which he successfully completed. Anthony Massengill was just 18 years old, even younger than Dupree. Unlike his future co-defendant, Massengill had no prior criminal record whatsoever. He was a clean-slate teenager navigating the challenges of becoming an adult in late 1970s Dallas. Both young men were products of their environment, working-class black Americans in a city where racial tensions still simmered beneath the surface. Dallas, in 1979, was a city in transition. The civil rights movement had brought legal changes, but social and economic inequalities persisted. For young black men like Dupree and Massengill, opportunities were limited, and encounters with law enforcement could quickly turn problematic. Neither man had any idea that they would soon become entangled in a case that would define criminal justice reform in Texas for decades to come. The two men knew each other casually, as many young people do in their neighborhood circles. They would sometimes hang out together, attend parties, and navigate the social scene that defined young adult life in Dallas. Their friendship was typical, built on shared experiences and the kind of casual camaraderie that develops naturally among peers. As November 1979 progressed, both Dupree and Massengill were focused on their daily lives. Dupree worked when he could find jobs, always looking for ways to support himself and contribute to his mother's household. Massengill was dealing with the typical concerns of an 18-year-old: relationships, work, and trying to figure out his future direction. On the evening of November 23, 1979, both young men were going about their normal Friday night activities, unaware that elsewhere in Dallas, events were unfolding that would forever change their lives. November 23, 1979, had started as an ordinary Friday evening for a young couple who decided to make a quick stop at a liquor store in the 5400 block of Dolphin Road near Interstate 30. The man needed cigarettes, and the woman wanted to use the payphone in the parking lot. It was a routine errand that would turn into a nightmare and eventually destroy 2 innocent lives. The liquor store was busy with Friday evening customers. The woman made her phone call while her partner went inside for cigarettes. As she finished her conversation, she noticed 2 black men using the payphone next to her. They appeared to be making their own calls. Nothing unusual about their behavior. When she completed her call, she walked back toward their car. Her partner helped her into the passenger seat and began walking around to the driver's side. That's when the night took a violent turn. One of the black men approached with a handgun drawn, ordering the man to get into the car. The gunman climbed into the back seat and pressed the weapon against the driver's head. The second attacker forced the woman to move to the center of the front seat and squeezed in beside her. The attackers immediately took control, ordering the terrified driver to get onto Interstate 30. As they drove, the men demanded money from both victims. The couple complied, handing over whatever cash they had with them. The atmosphere in the car was tense and dangerous, with the victims unsure whether they would survive the encounter. After driving for some time, the attackers ordered the car to pull over to the side of the road. They forced the male driver out of the vehicle. When the woman attempted to flee, she was grabbed and pulled back inside. The perpetrators then drove her to a nearby park, where the real horror began. At the park, both men raped the woman at gunpoint. They discussed killing her, debating whether to leave a witness alive. Ultimately, they decided to let her live, but kept her rabbit fur coat and driver's license as trophies. Before abandoning her, they warned that they would kill her if she reported the assault to police. The woman was found later that night, unconscious in a median by a police officer. She had survived a brutal attack that would haunt her forever. Her testimony would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case against 2 innocent men. 5 or 6 days after the attack, 2 men were spotted trying to sell a rabbit fur coat at a grocery store 2 miles from the liquor store. The stolen car was found in the parking lot. These men were not Cornelius Dupree Jr. or Anthony Massengill, but the real perpetrators would never be identified or prosecuted. Meanwhile, Dallas police were investigating multiple sexual assault cases from late November 1979. In addition to the November 23 Dolphin Road attack involving the couple, another sexual assault had occurred on November 30th, just 7 days later. Police believed these crimes might be connected and were actively seeking suspects who matched general descriptions provided by victims. The investigation was intensifying, with officers patrolling areas where the attacks had occurred and questioning potential suspects. Police had general descriptions of black male suspects, but no specific identifying features that would lead them to particular individuals. They were essentially looking for men who fit broad demographic profiles in the vicinity of recent crimes. On December 1, 1979, Cornelius Dupree Jr. and Anthony Massengill were walking together through their neighborhood, heading to a party. They had no knowledge of the ongoing police investigation and no reason to think they might become suspects in serious crimes. For them, it was simply another evening of socializing with friends in their community. About 2 miles from the scene of the Dolphin Road attack, when police stopped them. They were not stopped because they matched the description of the actual perpetrators from November 23rd. Instead, they were detained because officers thought they matched the description of suspects in a completely different, unrelated sexual assault that had occurred on November 30th, 1979. This fundamental error in police work would set the stage for one of the most egregious wrongful convictions in Texas history. When stopped, Massonville was carrying a pistol. This was legal in Texas, but it immediately raised suspicions among the officers. Dupree was unarmed. The next day, December 2nd, 1979, both victims from the Dolphin Road attack were brought in to view a photographic lineup. This is where the investigation took its most damaging turn. The female victim, still traumatized from her ordeal and eager to see justice done, identified both Dupree and Massonville as her attackers. The identification seemed certain to her. These were the faces of the men who had destroyed her life. With the identifications made, Dallas prosecutors moved forward with building their case against Cornelius Dupree Jr. and Anthony Massonville. What they had was thin. No physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, which wasn't available for criminal cases in 1979, and no confession from either defendant. Their entire case rested on the testimony of one trauma victim who had identified the wrong men. The lack of physical evidence should have been concerning to prosecutors. In a rape case, there typically would be biological evidence that could potentially link suspects to the crime. However, prosecutors proceeded without any such evidence, relying entirely on eyewitness testimony that was already showing signs of unreliability. The male victim's inability to identify either suspect presented a significant problem for the prosecution. Here was a person who had spent considerable time with the attackers, yet he could not identify the men police had arrested. Rather than viewing this as evidence that they had the wrong suspects, prosecutors apparently chose to minimize the importance of his testimony. Another significant issue emerged during the investigation. The woman's rabbit fur coat, which had been stolen during the attack, was reportedly offered for sale by two different men at a grocery store several days after the crime. These men were not Dupree or Massonville, yet this lead was not thoroughly pursued. The coat was a tangible piece of evidence that could have led to the real perpetrators, but the investigation focused instead on the two men already in custody. The prosecution decided to charge both men with aggravated robbery. The rape charges were held in abeyance, meaning prosecutors could pursue them later if needed. This strategic decision allowed them to focus on the robbery charges, which might be easier to prove, while keeping the rape charges as potential leverage. As the case moved toward trial, both defendants maintained their innocence. Dupree's only previous conviction was a burglary that had resulted in probation, which he had successfully completed. Massonville had no criminal record at all. June 1980 brought Cornelius Dupree Jr. and Anthony Massonville before a Dallas County jury to face charges that would determine the rest of their lives. The trial took place in Dallas County Criminal District Court, where both men were charged with aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon. The rape charges remained held in abeyance, meaning prosecutors could pursue them later, but were focusing on the robbery charges for now. The prosecution's case was straightforward but thin. They presented the testimony of both victims from the November 23, 1979 attack. The female victim took the stand and positively identified both Dupree and Massonville as the men who had carjacked, robbed, and raped her. Her testimony was emotional and compelling. She was certain these were the men who had destroyed her life. The male victim also testified, and in a development that should have raised serious questions, he now identified both defendants as the attackers. This was a dramatic change from his inability to identify either man in the photo lineup just months earlier. During the photographic identification process, he had been unable to pick out either suspect. Now at trial, he was certain they were guilty. This shift in testimony was problematic and should have been thoroughly explored by defense attorneys. Research on eyewitness identification shows that confidence can increase over time, even when the identification is wrong. The passage of time, repeated exposure to the suspect's photos, and the pressure of a trial setting can all contribute to increased certainty in an incorrect identification. The prosecution painted a picture of a violent carjacking and sexual assault, emphasizing the trauma suffered by the victims and the need for justice. They highlighted the fact that Massengill had been carrying a gun when arrested, though this weapon was never connected to the crime through ballistics or any other evidence. Defense attorneys faced significant challenges. In 1980, the science of eyewitness misidentification was not well understood or accepted in courtrooms. Defense lawyers could not call upon the extensive research that now exists, showing how memory can be unreliable, particularly in traumatic situations. They were forced to argue against seemingly certain eyewitness testimony without the scientific backing that would support their case today. The defendants themselves testified, maintaining their innocence. Dupree stated that he had been at home with his mother on the night of the attack. Massengill also provided an alibi, claiming he was elsewhere when the crime occurred. However, alibi evidence in 1980 was often viewed skeptically by juries, particularly when defendants had no independent witnesses to corroborate their whereabouts. If you're finding this story powerful, don't forget to subscribe for more real-life cases that expose the cracks in the justice system. Like this video to help it reach others who care about truth and accountability. On June 25, 1980, the jury returned guilty verdicts for both men. Dupree was sentenced to 75 years in prison for aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon. Massengill faced a more complex sentencing scenario because he was also dealing with the separate November 30, 1979 rape case. He ultimately received 3 10-year terms and a life sentence for the combined charges. The conviction sent 2 innocent men into the Texas prison system for what everyone expected would be the rest of their productive lives. Prison life in early 1980s Texas was defined by violence, overcrowding, and a culture that offered little hope for rehabilitation or redemption. Both men had to quickly learn the unwritten rules of survival in an environment where showing weakness could be fatal. They were no longer the young men who had been walking to a party in December 1979. They were now convicted criminals in the eyes of the system and their fellow inmates. Dupree was sent to serve his 75-year sentence with the knowledge that he was innocent of the crimes that had destroyed his life. This psychological burden was immense. Unlike guilty inmates who could at least find some peace through confession or repentance, Dupree faced the daily reality of knowing he was suffering for someone else's crimes. Massengill faced an even more complex situation. With a life sentence for one case and multiple 10-year terms for the others, his future looked even bleaker than Dupree's. The life sentence meant he would likely never see freedom again, barring some extraordinary intervention. Both men had to make crucial decisions about how to handle their incarceration. They could accept the system's judgment and try to make the best of their situation, or they could fight to prove their innocence. Both chose to fight, beginning what would become decades-long quests for exoneration. The appeals process started almost immediately. In the early 1980s, DNA testing was not available for criminal cases, so appellate attorneys had to rely on traditional grounds for appeal. Procedural errors, ineffective assistance of counsel, or problems with the evidence presented at trial. Prison authorities offered both men opportunities for early release through various programs, but these programs required admitting guilt for their crimes. For truly innocent men, this presented an impossible choice. Admitting to crimes they did not commit went against their fundamental sense of justice and truth. Dupree began writing letters to anyone who might listen: appellate courts, civil rights organizations, journalism outlets, and legal advocacy groups. His letters consistently maintained his innocence and pleaded for someone to take a fresh look at his case. The emotional toll of wrongful imprisonment was severe. Both men had to watch their families struggle with the shame and stigma of having a convicted rapist as a son or brother. Dupree's mother never wavered in her belief in his innocence, providing crucial emotional support throughout his ordeal. Years passed with little progress. Appeals were filed and denied. Letters went unanswered. The justice system seemed to have moved on from their cases, content that 2 criminals were behind bars and no longer a threat to society. As the 1980s turned into the 1990s, Cornelius Dupree Jr. and Anthony Massengill settled into the grim reality of long-term imprisonment for crimes they did not commit. The initial shock and anger of wrongful conviction had given way to a more determined, systematic approach to proving their innocence. Dupree became a student of the law during his imprisonment. He spent countless hours in the prison library, researching legal precedents, studying appellate procedures, and learning how to write effective legal briefs. This self-education would prove crucial as he navigated the complex appeals process over the coming decades. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals became intimately familiar with Dupree's case as he filed appeal after appeal. 3 times, the court turned him down, finding no grounds to overturn his conviction. Each rejection was a devastating blow, but Dupree refused to give up hope. His most recent appeal came in September 2005, a pro se plea for help. He filed it on his own without a lawyer, in which he once again maintained his innocence. This appeal, like the others before it, was a carefully crafted document that laid out the problems with his conviction and pleaded for a fresh examination of the evidence. In June 2006, the court denied his request. During these years, Dupree also faced pressure from the parole system to admit his guilt. On at least 2 occasions, he was offered the possibility of parole if he would participate in sex offender treatment programs. These programs required participants to acknowledge their crimes and express remorse for their actions. For Dupree, this presented an impossible choice. Admitting to crimes he did not commit would secure his freedom, but would also validate the wrongful conviction and potentially harm his chances for eventual exoneration. In 2004, he was actually set to be released and thought he was going home, until he learned he would first have to attend the sex offender treatment program. The program required what was known as the 4 R's: recognition, remorse, restitution, and resolution. Participants had to recognize that they had committed the crimes, express genuine remorse for their actions, accept responsibility for making restitution to victims, and demonstrate resolution to never reoffend. Dupree refused to participate, even though it meant remaining in prison. The 1990s brought revolutionary changes to criminal justice with the advent of DNA testing technology. Across the United States, old cases were being reopened, as this powerful new tool proved that many people had been wrongfully convicted. For inmates like Cornelius Dupree Jr. and Anthony Massengill, DNA testing represented the first real hope for proving their innocence after decades behind bars. The Innocence Project, founded in 1992 by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, began taking on cases of potentially wrongful convictions that could be resolved through DNA testing. The organization was flooded with letters from inmates claiming innocence and requesting help with DNA testing of evidence from their cases. In 2006, the Innocence Project finally began examining Dupree's claims of innocence in detail. The first step was determining whether any biological evidence from the 1979 crimes still existed. In many cases, evidence had been destroyed or lost over the decades, making DNA testing impossible. The discovery process revealed a remarkable fact. Dallas County's crime lab had been preserving biological evidence much longer than anyone realized. Authorities had thought that evidence was only preserved since 1981, but the search for evidence in Dupree's case revealed that some materials from the 1970s still existed. In 2007, the Innocence Project learned that pubic hair combings and cuttings from the rape victim were still preserved in the Dallas County Crime Lab. This was extraordinary news. Biological evidence from a 1979 crime that could potentially be tested for DNA evidence nearly 3 decades later. In July 2008, the Innocence Project contacted the Dallas County District Attorney's Office to request DNA testing of the preserved evidence. This began a process that would take several years to complete, as the testing had to be thorough and the results had to be verified through multiple rounds of analysis. May 10, 2010, marked a crucial milestone in the decades-long fight for justice, when Forensic Science Associates in Richmond, California, issued their initial DNA testing report on evidence from the 1979 Dallas rape case. The results were stunning and definitive. The biological evidence contained DNA from two distinct males, but neither profile matched Cornelius Dupree Jr. or Anthony Massengill. The testing had been conducted on pubic hair combings and cuttings taken from the rape victim during her medical examination in 1979. After more than 30 years, the biological material had degraded significantly, but advanced DNA analysis techniques were still able to extract usable genetic profiles. The discovery of two male DNA profiles was particularly significant because it matched the victim's account of being assaulted by two men. However, the genetic evidence proved conclusively that Dupree and Massengill were not those men. The DNA profiles belonged to the real perpetrators, who remained unidentified. To ensure the accuracy of these results, saliva samples were obtained from both Dupree and Massengill for comparison. On July 30, 2010, Forensic Science Associates confirmed their findings. The DNA testing excluded both men as sources of the genetic material found in the rape kit. The results created an immediate problem for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Dupree was scheduled to be released on parole on July 22, 2010, just days before the confirmatory DNA results were finalized. The timing was both fortunate and ironic. He would taste freedom for the first time in 30 years, just as science was proving his innocence. Dupree's release on parole came after years of fighting the system's attempts to make him admit guilt. He had successfully completed good time credits and earned the right to supervised release, but he left prison as a convicted felon required to register as a sex offender. The day after his release from prison, Dupree married his longtime fiancée, Selma Perkins. They had met approximately 20 years earlier when he was incarcerated, and she had stood by him throughout his fight for exoneration. Their marriage represented a moment of joy amid the ongoing struggle for legal vindication. Just 10 days after Dupree's release, the DNA results arrived confirming his innocence. The irony was profound. After 30 years of maintaining his innocence while imprisoned, he was finally proven right just days after gaining his freedom. However, additional testing was needed to satisfy all legal requirements. Authorities had to confirm that the 30-year-old biological material was indeed a DNA match to the victim, ensuring that the evidence tested was actually from the crime in question. The DNA results also cleared Anthony Massengill of the 1979 crime, but his situation remained more complex. Unlike Dupree, who had no other charges pending, Massengill was serving a life sentence for a separate sexual assault conviction from 1980. This meant that even though he was innocent of the crime that had led to his initial arrest, he would remain in prison pending resolution of the other case. January 4, 2011, became the day that justice finally arrived for Cornelius Dupree Jr., more than 30 years after his wrongful arrest. In a Dallas County courtroom packed with supporters, other exonerees, and media, State District Judge Don Adams delivered the words Dupree had waited 3 decades to hear. "You're free to go." Dupree's response to his exoneration was measured and philosophical. "It's a joy to be free again," he said, but he also acknowledged the complexity of his emotions. "I want to enjoy the moment, but I have mixed emotions with things in the past. No one heard my cry for justice. I had to wait 30 years." When asked about his feelings toward the system that had failed him, Dupree demonstrated remarkable grace. "What did happen happened," he told reporters. "It's in the past, and in order for me to get my life together, I have to forgive." While Cornelius Dupree Jr. walked free in January 2011, Anthony Massengill remained behind bars despite being cleared by the same DNA evidence. The complexity of Massengill's situation highlighted how multiple wrongful convictions could trap an innocent person in the system, even after some charges were proven false. If stories like this move you, if you believe the justice system should get it right the first time, then help make sure these stories are never forgotten. Subscribe for more real cases of wrongful convictions, racial bias, and the fight to uncover the truth. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters. Comment below. Do you think Anthony Massengill deserves a full exoneration? Share this video to raise awareness, because the more people know, the harder it is to look away. Justice delayed is justice denied. Let's keep demanding better.